Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to have here with us today Professor Lyle Massey from the Department of Art History in the School of Humanities. Hello, Lyle. How are you?
Hi, Annalisa. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. So, Lyle, what are you going to show us today?
So today you're going to see a video we made of me making a triple orange loaf cake. And this is, in a lot of ways, just a way to use all the citrus that we have in California. We are inundated, many of us, with fruit trees that bear a lot of citrus, a lot of lemons and oranges and limes. And so this is actually a very nice recipe for using a lot of orange juice and peel in a loaf cake that's kind of a modified pound cake. That's a very light and buttery cake, but soaked in orange, very, very orangey.
So did you use your own oranges from your backyard or did you buy some?
I'm lucky. I own a house that has actually 5 citrus trees at this point. We bought one that when we bought the house, it had 2 orange trees on the property, and then we added a couple more. We added a blood orange, and we have a caracara orange and a nickel orange, and then we also have lemons. I'm seeking more.
Right.
And some lime.
So is there a specific kind of orange that is best for this kind of cake, or any kind of orange would do?
Well, I did end up using our navel oranges, which are a bit sweeter. The juice oranges are a little more tart. They would probably work too, though. There's a lot of sugar in this cake, so you're balancing the acidity of the fruit against sugar. But I think pretty much any orange can be used. You could make it with blood orange, and it'd be a beautiful color. I think that would be lovely as well. So yeah, I think you have, and you can make it with lemon. You could actually do this as a lemon cake instead. Same principle.
Right, perfect. And so this is a very versatile recipe, but what was your motivation for picking this particular recipe, apart from the fact that it allows you to use all this citrus?
So I mean, every year we have to use our oranges, and I make a lot of marmalade and a lot of other favorite recipes as well. But I made this particular cake on the night before the inauguration. So it was January 19 that I made this cake for the first time this year, and I hadn't actually made it for a couple of years. And one of the reasons that I made it was the building anxiety about the inauguration, especially after the events of January 6th with the invasion of the Capitol. The building anxiety about it, but also the hope and prayer that everything was going to go well on the day of the inauguration. And I picked the orange cake because it was symbolic. There's a kind of allegorical element to this cake, which is that I had to use those oranges, but orange was also the color associated with the outgoing president. And so I made that cake, and in the morning we had slices of it, and with our coffee as we watched the helicopter leave with Trump in it. And then the rest of the day we watched the inauguration and were so relieved at the transfer, what was the peaceful transfer of power. Yes. And also we loved all of the events of the inauguration, and we were very, very happy to see the new occupants in the White House. So this was a ceremonial cake in a lot of ways.
Wonderful, wonderful. We need a new start with hopefully this terrible year will be, we start seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. We saw the end of the Trump era, hopefully, for good.
And it was I think it was such a tumultuous year in so many ways. It's almost impossible to categorize all of the sources of anxiety that we all had. And certainly one of the things that happened, I have called this a rage bake. I have to actually qualify that a little bit. Before the pandemic, literally a year ago, February, a book was published that was called Rage Baking: The Transformative Power of Flour, Fury, and Women's Voices. And it was published by, it was edited by 2 white women with contributions by a lot of sort of notable figures in food, food writing in the United States. But it was also published without acknowledging the origin of the hashtag Rage Baking. That the hashtag itself was coined by a woman, an African-American woman named Tangerine Jones, a blogger, who coined that hashtag on Instagram in 2015. So it was right around the time of the rise of Donald Trump as a candidate. Yes. She coined that term and started posting the things that she was baking. And that term, Rage Baking, really very specifically referred to her fears and anxieties surrounding racial justice. And so right before the pandemic started, this book was published in which they didn't acknowledge her at all. And it became, as you can imagine, a kind of scandal in which this sort of the racial animus and the racial problems in the United States were crystallized in this conflict between this book and this woman who had originated the whole idea of rage baking. So I wanted to say immediately, I'm calling this an act of rage baking, but I want to absolutely acknowledge that I understand this as solidarity with somebody like Tangerine Jones, who was cooking and baking specifically to express her needs regarding racial justice and what she saw as the racial injustices in her life and in the United States. So that said, I think so many of us were rage baking this whole last year. It's been such a stressful year. I know so many people, so many neighbors and friends got sourdough starters going and started baking every week. And part of that was the pandemic, us being all locked at home. And so your kitchen was your only place to find an outlet. But it was also that, there were so few things that we could do. And then as soon as George Floyd was murdered and we had BLM, protests all over, and then the political realm started heating up for the election. It just got worse and worse, and it seemed often for me personally that baking was one of the few outlets that I had to kind of get in there. And I did a lot of symbolic baking. This lasted a long line of symbolic bakes.
What else did you bake during this turbulent, to say the least, year?
Well, so before this, the last thing I had baked that was symbolic was, this was November 7. So it was right when the networks finally called the election for Biden and Harris after a week of that incredible tension after the election itself. And I baked a Banbury cake, which is a very complicated English cake that is in a checkerboard pattern. It was sort of a raspberry and lemon checkerboard cake, and it was draped in marzipan, which I made myself. So it's a very complicated cake, and probably not worth, honestly, all of that work. But we had that with a bottle of champagne. And one of the interesting things about Banbury cake is that it is traditionally served on the Feast of St. George. And as a Europeanist, as somebody who basically works on Renaissance art history, that registered with me that we were slaying a dragon here. And so St. George was on my back.
Yes.
I was making that cake, and that was it was the dragon being slayed on November 7th.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Lyle, so much for, reminding us of all the significance of baking during this year, and also, during the Trump era, as a way of expressing rage and finding an outlet for frustration, and also for reminding us of the origin of the hashtag. And also, in the end, for presenting this cake to us as a cake for celebration. And hopefully we are all seeing the end of this turbulent times. And I really hope that next year, in the 2021, and then surely in 2022 we will be able to go back to something like our normal and forget about this new normal that I don't think really suits us so well. But anyway, here we are. So thank you once again for being with us, and to all of you who are watching us, goodbye and enjoy. Bye.
Always a good time for cake and coffee.
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Lyle Massey. I am faculty in the Department of Art History at UCI. And today I'm going to take you through baking a triple orange loaf cake. So I grew up in California, was born and raised in Long Beach, but my parents moved from originally the East Coast, but from Chicago. They ended up in Chicago, and they moved to California in the 1950s. And they have memories of getting to the state, coming over the state lines, through the San Bernardinos, and smelling the orange blossoms. California was a promised land, and oranges were absolutely a part of that promise. My parents, who had grown up in the East, basically always had winter, and when they got to California, there was no winter. And there were orange blossoms and the sweet smell of orange blossoms everywhere. When they bought a house in the 1950s, my parents bought a tree, an orange tree, and planted it. And it took about 15 years for that tree to finally bear fruit. But when it did, there were hundreds of oranges on it. We also had a kumquat in our yard as well. So my parents embraced the whole idea of having citrus fruit, particularly in the winter. And my father would juice that tree, or make juice from that tree every weekend for us with this wonderful manual juicer that my mother got for him. But we also cooked with it. We cooked savory recipes, but we also baked a lot of orange flavored sweets. And in fact, in my family, we have a giant sweet tooth. So my sisters and my mother and I bake a lot. So one of the things I wanted to do with you today was to bake an orange cake that uses 3 forms of orange in it. It's a cake that has orange juice and orange zest in the cake. It is then soaked in an orange syrup and then has, at the end, an orange icing that you pour over it. Now, I'm a kind of a nose to tail orange believer. So one of the things that I do, these are actually the oranges that come from our tree that I'm using for today. One of the things that I do is I want to use the peel as well. You want to use every part that you can. So I make a candied orange peel that's just basically for decoration. It's also quite delicious on its own. What you do is you take 1.5 cups of sugar, 1.5 cups of water, and you bring it to a boil on the stove, and then you add orange peel to it. Now, in order to do this, you peel basically 1 large orange. And when you do that, you sort of remove a little bit of the pith on the inside. Then you slice the orange into very thin slices, maybe about 1/4 inch thick, and then slice each one of those segments maybe into thirds. So you end up with a short segment of orange peel that looks something like this. So you're going to actually put that into this boiling water and sugar mixture, take it down to a simmer for about 45 minutes until each one of these pieces of peel is tender. Then you drain it, and when it's still a little warm, it doesn't have to be hot, in fact you don't really want it to be hot, but when it's still a little warm and hasn't cooled off completely and gotten so sticky that you can't actually take these segments apart from one another, you roll those segments in castor sugar. Castor sugar is a fine sugar. They call it castor in England, but it's basically a fine sugar that's somewhere between powdered sugar and regular granulated sugar. So you roll these in that, and then you leave them out so that they dry. Could be a couple of hours, maybe overnight. The key about orange peel, candied orange peel, is that it's supposed to click when you put it on a plate. You want it crisp, you don't want it rubbery. So it should sound like this when in fact you drop it on a plate. So we're going to use that for decoration. And I have to say that I hadn't made this cake in a while, but the first time that I made it this year was on January 19, the night before the inauguration of President Biden and President Harris. And I made it symbolically, thinking that my husband and I would sit in the morning, eat this orange cake in order to say goodbye to the outgoing president whose color was orange as he left on the helicopter. This was after such a tumultuous and difficult year for so many of us suffering from the pandemic, from Black Lives Matter protests and the killing of George Floyd. So many things were happening. And then in the run up to the election, we saw everything get more intensified in the time between the election and the inauguration. So it was a relief to see this, but we also wanted to celebrate it, the end of what we hoped was an era that we would not see or visit again. So we are going to bake this cake, and it's a loaf cake. As with any cake like this, you start by creaming butter and sugar. So with this cake, we basically have 1.5 sticks. Now, one of the very important things here to know and to remember is always let your cold ingredients come to room temperature. So I let my butter come to room temperature. That means it's a bit softer and won't actually clog up, become sort of difficult in the mixer, excuse me. I also let my eggs come to room temperature. So we're going to turn this on and cream this butter. When it's room temperature, it's very easy to do that. If it's cold from the fridge, you can hear it in the mixer, excuse me, immediately. So I'm going to add sugar to this now. Slowly. You always want to add your dry ingredients slowly, or they will cloud up and you'll have flour or sugar all over your face in the kitchen. And so you want that to get very light and fluffy. As you incorporate the sugar into the butter, you want a light and fluffy mixture. Okay, that looks good. So now we're going to add 1 egg at a time. And it is important to only add 1 at a time and fully incorporate it before you add the second one. I usually turn the mixture off too. I have been known to try to do it when it's going and then dropping the entire egg in by accident, and then you lose everything because all of the eggshell gets spread throughout the mixture. So 1 egg. Turn that mixer back on. And you know it's incorporated when you can't see any of the shiny part of the egg. So the whites no longer are making it look shiny, and it gets fully incorporated. You also always, with anything like this, you want to make sure you scrape the sides to get that mixture back down in so that everything is incorporated. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to add that second egg. Bring that down again. Okay, so we have our egg and butter and sugar mixture here. My dog, Sequoia, is going in and out of the kitchen. He's by far my most avid cooking fan. The last time I made this, as I was practicing for this, he managed to consume about a half of one of these orange cakes that I've made that I stupidly left out on the counter. So we are now going to have to add both dry and wet mixtures to this base. So the dry mixtures is flour with a leavening ingredient and salt. So they used to make you, in old recipes, they would call for sifting all these ingredients together. The common wisdom now is that you don't need to do that anymore. You can use a whisk to whisk all of those ingredients together. So we have a cup and a half of flour, and that's just all-purpose flour. And then 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, which is our leavening ingredient here, and a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. These are great. These are little shot glasses that my husband got for me. They have ounce marks on them, milliliters, teaspoons, and tablespoons. So I guess you know how much you're drinking if you're having a shot of tequila, but you also can use them for cooking. They're very, very nice for cooking. So we're going to whisk that together. So, and the whisk basically distributes everything very evenly. Now we also have wet ingredients. So with this is the orange flavoring for the loaf. 3 tablespoons of fresh orange juice and 1 heaping tablespoon of orange zest. Now zesting is a very, very important part of working with citrus. One very important thing to know about that is when you're zesting, you only want the orange rind on the outside. So I have this is a really great grater. It's a fine plane grater, much finer than you would get from a box grater. And when you zest, you want only the orange part of the rind. So I'm showing you how to do that here. You don't want any of the white pith. If you remember peeling an orange when you were a kid or an adult, I guess, when you peel the orange rind all the way off, the inside is usually white. The white is called pith, as opposed to the orange rind on the outside. And it can actually be quite bitter, so you don't want to cook with that. In the cases like this where you're adding what's called zest, you only want the outside part. You can tell whether or not you've done it right. When you look at the orange, it should still be kind of yellow or orange underneath. If it's white there, you've gone too far. Okay, so we have our orange juice mixed with our zest right here. But we're going to add a couple of more ingredients to that as part of the wet ingredients. So one thing that you add for this cake is a 1/4 cup of sour cream, or in this case, I use creme fraiche, which is a lighter sort of French form of sour cream. I like it because it's a little lighter. I find that it is something I'd rather have in the fridge. I wouldn't eat sour cream, but I do use creme fraiche. You're also going to add a 1/4 cup of buttermilk. Now, buttermilk is one of those things that most people don't have around, and you certainly probably don't really want to buy it. I have it, so I'm going to add store-bought buttermilk. But you don't have to if you don't want to have buttermilk around because you don't know if you'll use it or drink it. You can make your own buttermilk. All it takes is a cup of milk. It can be whole milk, 2%. Apparently, you can even do this with almond milk. And you add an acid to it. So it would be a tablespoon of lemon juice or a tablespoon of white vinegar to the cup of milk. You let it sit for a little bit, and then you have buttermilk. Much easier and much more efficient than stocking it in your fridge. Okay, so this is our buttermilk and orange juice and sour cream mixture. So when you're adding dry and wet ingredients like this, by the way, the reason you cook with buttermilk or to cook with buttermilk and sour cream is it makes a very tender, very fine crumb in a cake. And that's what it does in this one. So for something like a pound cake kind of a dish like this, or a baked cake like this is going to lighten it and make it very fine and almost a silky crumb. So when you are adding wet and dry ingredients, you start with, you don't dump it all in at the same time. You alternate between them. And you always start with dry ingredients and you always end with dry ingredients. So we're gonna add this in thirds and this in twos. So we're gonna start with our dry ingredients, add a third, mix that in. And you always start slowly so that you don't end up with a cloud of flour around you. You also often have to stop and scrape down the sides of the bowl so that you end up with getting all those ingredients incorporated. Okay, and now we're going to add half of our wet ingredients. The second third of our dry. Scraping down again. I used to have a very old Sunbeam mixer, that I loved, and it broke down a couple of years ago, and I had to get a KitchenAid because they don't make the Sunbeams anymore, and I miss it. It was a much lighter mixer than the KitchenAid, which is very heavy. It's hard to get up and down. But also, the bowl was a lot easier to navigate. And now we have the rest of the second addition and the end of our wet ingredients. Scrape it down a bit, and we're going to add our final dry ingredient, third. Remember, you always start and end with your dry ingredients. So during this pandemic, so many people started pivoting to the kitchen to entertain themselves and to cook and bake during this lockdown, the many lockdowns that we've been through. A lot of people baked sourdough, started sourdough starters, and then baked a lot of bread. I ended up baking a lot of sweets, for better or for worse. Also gained a couple of pounds that I'm now trying to get off. But it was very satisfying to do it, in part, I guess, just because it was creative. A lot of people sort of worked off their creativity in the kitchen. But it also was this sort of way of trying to work out anxiety and rage about what was happening and all the things that we couldn't control. Okay, so that's done. So we now have our batter. I have preheated the oven to 350. And we're going to put this batter into the loaf pan that I've prepared. So this is the loaf pan that I'm using. A loaf pan is a standard loaf pan. It's the kind that you would buy even in a regular supermarket, so Albertsons or Ralph's. It's a 9 by 5 inch loaf pan. Now I always line my cake pans. In this case, what I've done is cut first grease the pan and then cut a piece of parchment paper to line it. You can see one of the things I do is I make it so that the parchment paper, there are kind of little handles here. You have to grease the pan first, put the parchment paper in, and then grease the parchment paper. And we do that to help prevent a cake from cracking or breaking when you take it out of a pan. And I've had that happen so many times, and it's so aggravating. And I've certainly also had to resort to fixing those kinds of breaks and cracks with frosting and other kinds of things. But we don't want that to happen today. So we're gonna use this parchment paper to line the pan so that we can make sure that this cake will come out. So I'm gonna fill this pan with the batter, and then I have to level it out. It's a very thick batter, so it's not gonna, I have to level it out and flatten it on the top and make sure that the batter fills all the different corners of the pan, the four corners of the pan. Okay. And then we're gonna pop it in to the oven. You bake it for about, honestly, my oven, the oven that I have here at this house, this oven is an oven that doesn't run hot. So I end up often having to bake longer than the time that's specified on the recipe. So in this case, I'm doing it about 45 to 50 minutes. I think on the recipe I say something like 40 to 45. It really depends so often on what your oven does. They're not all created equal, they don't all look the same. So there, and we're gonna put it in the oven for 45 minutes. I always set the timer because I will forget. Timers are definitely the most fail-safe way to make sure that you don't burn or undercook your food. So it turns out I actually made one beforehand because I thought it would take so long for us to go through this whole process. So I have a finished one here, and I'm going to show you the next steps. So we have, clean this up. One thing that's always true is that you're constantly cleaning up when you're baking because there's so much stuff that happens to your counters. So we're going to make our first syrup. This is actually called a drizzle. If any of you have ever watched the Great British Baking Show, you'll know what this is. This is a very United Kingdom kind of recipe. They call them drizzle cakes. And what they are is they make a syrup, usually a flavored syrup, and then soak a cake in it. So that's what we're going to do for our second layer of orange here. So for the drizzle, we basically have a 1/4 cup of orange juice, fresh. This is a juicer that I got many years ago from a vintage store. Very nice because it actually has a cup with markings on the outside, so you know how much you're getting. You can use it as a measuring cup. So I juiced a 1/4 cup of orange juice. And I'm going to add what's called caster sugar, this fine sugar. I'm going to add that to make a drizzle. What you want is to have the orange juice and the sugar dissolve together to make a syrup. That's what we're going to use to cover this cake. Now, for a drizzle cake, one thing that's very important is it's not going to soak in if you don't have some entry points in the cake itself. So I take a toothpick, and we're going to need lots of holes here. Toothpick isn't very big, but you can use it to make dozens of tiny holes, and the syrup should descend into those holes into the cake itself. And that's what you want. You want this sort of extra layer of orange flavor in the cake. So I'm going to use my toothpick to just make many holes in the cake. All over at the edges, particularly. You want that syrup to soak in everywhere. So I would say almost hundreds of little holes, depending on how much satisfaction I'm getting in actually stabbing something here. Okay, so we've done our holes, and now, once we have the syrup, we're going to spoon this syrup slowly over the cake. I usually do this, you do want the cake to cool, maybe 15, 20 minutes. I don't mind if it's a little bit warm still, rather than completely cold or completely room temperature. So I actually think a little bit of warmth in the cake helps spread the drizzle a bit. Anyway, we're gonna then spoon this drizzle over the cake and then have it all seep down. Now, as it happens, I already did the drizzle on this cake, so I'm gonna save this for the one that's in the oven right now. I wanted to show you how it's done. So now we're going to have to, once you've done your drizzle and you've let all that syrup soak in, now you want to put it on a plate. I'm going to show you how to actually deplate this. So usually I don't put parchment paper on the ends, which means you do have to loosen the ends with a knife to make sure that they will come out, which I did before I started this video. So you can lift it out. This is a very effective way of getting this out. And one of the reasons also that I leave it in the pan when I do the drizzle is that prevents the drizzle from flowing off. And that then hopefully more of it will soak into the cake. So I do leave it in the pan for the drizzle. After that though, I take it out. Here we go. In this case, we now have our cake unmolded. And now we're going to do the third part of the triple. And that is, we are going to do an icing. All of these parts are lovely. It's a sweet cake, but you want that sort of intense orange flavor. So we're going to make an icing to drizzle over the cake, but it's not the drizzle. It's actually decorative and it's more like an icing. So what do you do for an icing? An icing starts with powdered sugar. Now, one thing I'll say is that all powdered sugar is not created equal. You can get the supermarket varieties. They sometimes taste a little chemical to me. So I will invest in better powdered sugar. I'll get an organic brand from someplace like Mother's or Whole Foods. You can actually taste the difference. So I recommend for powdered sugar to look for ones that are not the sort of standard supermarket versions. The other thing you do with powdered sugar that you have to do when you make an icing is you do need to sift it. If you don't sift it with a sifter, for those of you who don't know what a sifter is, if you don't actually put it through a sifter, you're going to end up with lots of lumps in your icing. So you want to put it through a sifter to make sure that it's very fine and it's a powder. And that will prevent your icing from having lumps. So for this icing, we add another teaspoon of zest, of orange zest, using our plain grater. So here we have it. I add it just to the sugar. And for the powdered sugar, this is 1.5 cups of powdered sugar with 1 teaspoon of orange zest. And then we have 4 to 5 tablespoons of fresh orange juice once again. We're going to add to our powdered sugar and zest mixture. Now you should add this fairly slowly. So you maybe will start with maybe 2 ounces. So you don't want to put the whole thing in right away because you're trying for the exact right consistency for an icing. And it's hard to tell. It may be very cakey like this, and you'll think, oh, it needs more liquid, but keep stirring because for whatever reason, the relationship between powdered sugar and liquid isn't immediately rational. You think that it's going to be very, very dry, and the more you stir, you realize it's getting looser and looser. Now in this case, it is a kind of a big lump, so I'm going to add some more of the orange juice. But again, very little, because even though it's a lump like this, you just sort of see, it will get loose very fast if I add too much liquid. So I'm going to add just a little bit more. And we'll see, maybe like another ounce. So one thing about an icing, it has to be thick enough to not just slide down the cake immediately, but thin enough to pour. So I think this is a little thick, so that is probably too thick. It's not really pourable, so I'm going to add a little bit more liquid. And you can sort of see when you take the spoon up and let the icing itself pour down, whether it's the right consistency. So that's probably good. It might be a little loose, actually. But I think that's probably pretty good. So in order to decorate the cake, I don't just pour the icing on. I think that's, it doesn't really need that much more sugar on it. I'm going to use it decoratively and just sort of do stripes on a diagonal across the cake. So I do that by just sort of letting it pour off the spoon and then draping it like this across the cake. So we want a pretty pattern, right? We want it to be decorative, sort of zebra stripes. And again, we don't need tons and tons of it because we already have that drizzle in there. So we've got quite a bit of sugar and orange flavoring on this to begin with. And a lot of it goes on the plate anyway, or ends up on the plate. I'm going to also add one sort of stripe down the middle, which is also where I'm going to put my orange, candied orange peel. Okay, so that's good. And now we have our candied orange peel. Remember that nice clinking sound? They're delicious. And orange peel tastes very, very different from orange juice. Orange juice is sweeter, doesn't have an edge to it. Orange peel has a slightly bitter, acidic edge to it, and that's actually what makes it so wonderful. And it smells different and it tastes different from orange. It's very good. Okay, so here we're just going to add a couple of pieces of candied orange peel to the top, just for decoration, as well as some of that interesting taste, that sort of bittersweet taste that orange peel adds that is different from the sweeter orange juice. And there you have it. We have our orange, triple orange loaf. And I will say this is absolutely delicious with coffee, with tea, and keeps for a very long time. And it's a great thing to end an era that we hope we will never have to suffer through again, to say goodbye to all things orange. Thank you so much.